3. Bodies. Though morning seemed to come too early, Sarah managed to rouse herself. The bed she'd slept in was so comfortable that it was a struggle to get up, but she'd eventually won the fight. She scrambled back into the clothes she'd worn the previous day, wishing she'd thought to bring along a change from the TARDIS. Of course, she had not expected the events of the previous day. What she'd hoped for was a pleasant chat with Rudyard Kipling on a veranda in India somewhere, and then back to the TARDIS. She should have known better by now. There was a pitcher and basin on the dressing table, both made from china decorated with red flowers of some indeterminate species. She splashed water on her face, then used a brush that Alice had loaned her to comb out her hair. It wasn't a very good toilet, but it was the best she could do in this place. What she'd give to be back in the TARDIS's bathroom. There was a gentle rap on the door. When Sarah opened it, Alice was waiting outside. "I thought a little breakfast and a cup of tea might help you before your journey into town," she said. "The breakfast room is being prepared, and I'll take you down." "Bless you," said Sarah happily. "I could just murder a cup of tea." Alice laughed. "You have a strange way of speaking, Sarah." "I've got a lot of strange ways," Sarah answered, as they walked down the elegant corridor together. "That's what happens when you travel as much as I do, I suppose." "It must be nice," Alice remarked wistfully. "I've not been about much. When Roger and I are married, though, he has promised me that we shall honeymoon in Paris." Her eyes sparkled. "That sounds quite exciting. Have you ever been to Paris?" "Lots of times," Sarah admitted. "It's a great place. I'm sure you'll love it there." Alice sighed. "Oh, how I envy you. You seem to have done so much, and I so little." Sarah laughed. "You don't know the half of it." It took a great deal of effort, but Sir Edward Fulbright managed to hold his temper in check. It seemed as though his house was filled at the moment with guests that he either disliked or distrusted. In Ross's case, perhaps both. After dressing for breakfast, he emerged from his room to almost run into another barely welcome guest. "Good morning," said the doctor, politely doffing his hat. "I hope you slept well." "Tolerably," growled Fulbright. The doctor gave him a warm smile. "I suspect we got off on the wrong foot last night, Sir Edward," he said. "I'm certain that we both want the same thing, the removal of the creature that hunts on the moors at night. Our only difference is that you wish to slay it, and I wish to remove it for study. I'm sure we're both reasonable men. Can't we come to some sort of amicable arrangement here?" Fulbright grudgingly had to admit that the man had a point. "What do you suggest?" "Let me make one attempt to capture it," the doctor offered. "If that fails, then you can have a try at killing it." He grinned. "I'd let you have the first go. Your solution is a trifle more permanent than mine." Fulbright grunted. "I'll consider it, Doctor," he finally said. "If you can come up with a scheme that sounds like it'll work, I'll go along with it." "More than fair," the doctor answered happily. Perhaps he had misjudged this fellow after all. Fulbright had to concede that he hadn't been in the best of tempers the previous evening, and the chappie seemed to be pretty reasonable. "Do you think you can help Sir Alexander with this mysterious death in the village?" he asked. "I can but try," the doctor answered. "I've some small acquaintance with matters of mystery." "And," broke in Ross's voice, "some contributions of your own to the cause of mystery. Your last name, for instance." Fulbright's brightening mood instantly started to cloud over once again. He hadn't even heard the man approaching. "The doctor is trying to help," Fulbright pointed out, "which is more than you appear to be doing." Ross raised an eyebrow. "I see. So my leading the hunt for that monster last night was no help at all." "I'm still not convinced that you've told us all that you know about that apparition," Fulbright snapped. "You have a secretive air about you." "And this doctor doesn't?" asked Ross, mockingly. He turned to the stranger. "You still haven't told us your last name." "No," agreed the doctor amiably. "I haven't." "And why are you here?" "Counter-attack, eh?" Ross appeared to be amused. "As a guest of Sir Edward's daughter and future son-in-law." The doctor shook his head slowly. "Oh, no, that's not it at all, Colonel. Sir Edward is perfectly correct. There's something you know that you're not telling us." Ross smiled. "I see. And you, of course, have been perfectly candid with everyone." The doctor matched his smile. "As much as I can be. Do you intend to take part in this autopsy today also?" "Goodness me, no!" Ross shook his head. "It all sounds very messy and quite disgusting. I had thought that my man Abercrombie and I would take a stroll on the moors." "Bird watching?" asked Sir Edward acidly. "Your man said he's no ornithologist." Ross didn't look at all embarrassed. I doubt he could pronounce the word. "Actually, I had thought about collecting a few wild flowers." He bowed to them both. "If you'll excuse me." Fulbright watched the man leave, scowling. "I don't trust him at all," he admitted candidly. There was something about the doctor, though, that made him seem to be trustworthy. And something about the way he dressed. Fulbright shuddered at the garish scarf and silly clothing. "Do you intend to go along dressed like that?" he asked. The doctor appeared bemused, as though he'd never considered anything else. "Why? Too flashy, you think?" Fulbright snorted. "Sir Alexander is rather traditionally minded," he commented. "If you wish to make a good impression, you'd dress more conservatively." The doctor looked confused. "I'm afraid all of my luggage is stuck out on the moors right now." "Not a problem," Fulbright assured him. "You're about my size. I'm sure I can loan you a few items to tide you over." "Most generous," the doctor replied. "I'd be very grateful." "This way, then." Sarah had polished off a plate of kippers and 3 cups of tea when the footman announced that the coach was ready. She felt much more prepared to face whatever the day would bring, and the news that she wouldn't be walking into the village cheered her even more. Saying goodbye to Alice, she followed the servant out of the large main doors. In front of the steps stood a landau, with a coachman already at the reins. Beside the carriage, chatting animatedly, stood the doctor, Sir Edward, and Sir Alexander. Sarah couldn't help smiling at the doctor's appearance. He'd put aside his normal attire for once, and actually looked rather dashing. He wore a checkered cape coat and a deerstalker hat. Sarah slipped up beside him. "Didn't you get a pipe with that outfit?" she joked. "It's in my pocket," the doctor replied gravely. "Thankfully, it isn't lit." "Ah, Miss Smith," said the magistrate, bowing over her hand. He turned to Fulbright. "Well, old man, it looks like we're ready to go now." "You will all return for dinner, I trust?" asked Fulbright. Sarah grinned. "If it's half as good as breakfast, Sir Edward," she assured him, "wild horses couldn't keep me away." "Or wild hounds either," added the doctor. "Splendid!" Fulbright beamed at them both. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your work. Good luck, all of you." Alice watched the carriage leave the driveway, smiling to herself. She was certain that she had discovered a new friend in Sarah. She might be a trifle unusual due to her nomadic lifestyle, but she was pleasant and personable, and Alice was glad of another woman her age about the house. It was nice to have men about, but she liked another woman to talk with. She was about to move on from the window alcove she'd been observing the grounds from, when she heard Edmund Ross's voice. She rather liked the young officer, whom Roger had known for several years, even though she knew her father was not so fond of the man. Before she could emerge to introduce herself into the conversation, however, she realised Ross was speaking to that strange little servant of his, Abercrombie. "It's a shame that Sir Edward didn't go with the others, Abercrombie," Ross commented. "It would have made searching the house so much easier." Alice stopped still, shocked at what she had just heard. It would not be a wise move to show herself now, she decided. Instead, she waited, hoping to hear more. "You want me to have a nose about?" asked Abercrombie. "Yes," replied Ross, "and do try to be a little more circumspect. The maids have been noticing you, and not because of your debonair charms. I thought you were supposed to be the best burglar in the West End." "Yeah, but this ain't the West End," Abercrombie complained. "I'm doing my best." "I'm sure you are, but do better." Ross paused a moment, then added, "I'm going to search inside the house. If you see anything of value, you know how to contact me." Alice hardly dared breathe in case she was discovered. With relief, she heard the men move away from the alcove. She waited another couple of minutes, and then timidly peered around the corner. The corridor was empty. The men had gone. What should she do now? It was quite clear that Ross was not here as Roger's friend, whatever he had claimed. And he had called that creature of his a burglar. It was obvious to her that Ross was here to steal something from the house. She felt angry and betrayed, but she didn't know how to handle this. If she told her father what she had heard, Papa would probably have Ross horsewhipped. The only thing Alice could think of was to tell Roger and let him handle his so-called friend. She hurried off to find her fiancé. Doyle had breakfasted and shaved by the time that the one-armed ex-sailor, Brackley, turned up on the Hope to say that Constable Faversham would like him to come along. Doyle had already cleared this with Captain Grey, so he scooped up his medical bag and followed Brackley with an anticipation of an interesting day. He had had a good night's sleep and had risen early to check through the few medical volumes he'd brought with him on the voyage. There had been references to shark attacks in one of these, but, as Doyle had already felt certain, the patterns didn't match the case of the previous evening. Nothing more had really occurred to him, but the conviction had grown that this was no shark attack and that there was a definite mystery behind the corpse. "Whatever happened to the poor man's boat?" he asked Brackley, as they hurried along the quay towards the Pig and Thistle. "The men brought it in, sir," the retired sailor answered. "It's berthed behind the tavern. Will you be wanting to see it later?" "I believe so," Doyle replied. "There may be evidence or clues aboard it that will aid in the investigation of this matter." Taking one of his few remaining half-crowns from his pocket, he slipped it to the one-armed man. This would be a good investment if a story came out of this mystery. "See that it remains undisturbed, will you?" Brackley gave him a broken-toothed grin. "You can count on me, sir." "I'm sure I can." Doyle felt that he had done all that he could for the moment. There was a real sense of excitement growing within him. It was a shame that the old man had died, and perished so brutally, but it might be the opportunity he'd been praying for. The Pig and Thistle was a smallish building, a typical country pub. There was a tap bar and a smoking lounge, plus a couple of rooms upstairs for the landlord and his wife, and one for the barmaid. There were 2 other rooms that were rented out if they were needed, but Doyle knew they were currently empty. There weren't a lot of travellers that passed through Bodham. If the Hope sailed on before he was done, Doyle was certain he could take one of the rooms for a modest price to enable him to see this through to the end. The body of old Ben Tolliver was laid out in the stables behind the tavern. Constable Faversham was seated outside the small building, dozing slightly in the morning sunshine. Doyle wondered if the man had stood, or sat, on guard all night. He had mentioned something about being the only law officer in the area. He was probably glad to have Brackley around to carry messages for him. Faversham snapped awake with a jerk as Doyle hurried over. "Good morning, sir," the constable said, rising uncomfortably to his feet and straightening his tie. "I was just catching a few nods, waiting for you to arrive." Doyle pulled out his watch. "Almost 8:30, he observed. "Do you think that Sir Edward will be here soon?" "I'm expecting him any time now, sir," Faversham answered. "Ah, this is Dr. Martinson now." Doyle glanced around to see an elderly man walking carefully across the tavern's cobbled yard. Some of the stones were rather slippery from ale spilled the previous night. Martinson was clearly into his 60s, but a spry old bird for all that. He had an aquiline nose and a shock of white hair that gave him more than a passing resemblance to an eagle. Doyle stuck out his hand as the older man approached. "Ship's Surgeon Doyle," he introduced himself. "Martinson," the other replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I gather from Faversham here that you made a preliminary examination of the body last night?" "Purely a cursory one, I'm afraid," Doyle answered. "The light was very poor, but I feel certain that Tolliver was not attacked by a shark. What did kill him is a mystery thus far." "Ah," Martinson chuckled. "I, too, am sure he wasn't killed by a shark," he commented. "I didn't need to examine the body to tell you that. There have been no such attacks around here for decades, to my knowledge, and certainly not in Bodham Bay." He winked. "So we'll have our work cut out for us today, I imagine." "Rather," agreed Doyle. He was quite warming up to the old man. "I trust you have no objection to my assisting you?" "My dear chap, of course not. Many hands make light work, as they say, and at my age you appreciate the lightest possible work." He spun around to face the street. "Ah, this must be Sir Alexander. Capital! We can soon commence." A landau drew to a halt outside the tavern entrance, and the footman jumped down to offer his hand to the first passenger that descended. To Doyle's surprise and pleasure, it was a young woman, and a pretty one too. She was followed by an older man, richly dressed and clearly the justice himself. The final figure who emerged from the carriage caught Doyle's eye. He was almost as interesting as the young woman. In his cape coat and deerstalker hat, with a prominent nose and a steely eye, he was clearly a man to be reckoned with. The trio came through the gateway and into the courtyard. Dr. Martinson waved as they approached. "Glad you could make it, Sir Alexander," he called. "Who are your friends?" Sir Alexander shook the medical man's hand. "Glad you're here, Walter. Allow me to introduce Miss Sarah Jane Smith and the doctor." "Doctor, eh?" asked Martinson. "Of what?" "Everything but medicine," the doctor replied, his gale resting on Doyle. "Haven't we met somewhere before?" "I don't believe so," Doyle replied. "You don't look like the sort of man I'd forget in a hurry." He held out his hand. "Ship's Surgeon Doyle." Sarah's eyes lit up at this. "Off the Hope?" she asked eagerly. Doyle was taken somewhat aback at her knowledge. "Why, yes, but how the blazes did you know that?" Sarah laughed in delight. "I've read your stories," she told him. To his surprise, she shook his hand as a man would have done. "You're one of my favourite authors, you know, Arthur Conan Doyle." Doyle felt himself blushing. "Actually, you flatter me too much, Miss Smith," he replied. "I've had only one story published so far, but it's most gratifying to know that you enjoyed it so much." "I'm sure we'll be reading much more by you in the future," Sarah told him. "You're a natural." "Well," broke in Sir Alexander, "I hate to stop all this cheeriness, but we do have work to do, gentlemen and lady." Faversham stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, sir, but—" he shuffled somewhat uncomfortably. "I don't think that body is a fit sight for a lady?" "Oh, quite." The justice turned to Sarah. "Perhaps you had better wait for us here, young lady." "What?" Sarah's face fell. "Come off it. I'm not squeamish, I'll have you know." The doctor patted her shoulder. "I think it would be better if you waited, Sarah," he said. "I'll fill you in later." "Well, thanks a lot," said Sarah huffily. She threw her hands in the air and stalked off. Typical. Going off to have all the fun and leaving her to her own devices. As if she hadn't seen plenty of dead bodies in her travels with the doctor. "What a way to start the day," she grumbled. "I'll bet it just gets worse." There was a low whistle from outside the gateway. Sarah hurried over and peered around the corner, straight into 3 familiar faces. "Morning," said Rudyard Kipling breezily. "It just got worse," sighed Sarah. The stable had clearly been neglected for a number of years. There were small holes in the walls that allowed light in, and windows that were so encrusted with dirt that they didn't. Cobwebs laced the whole structure, possibly helping to hold it together, Doyle mused, and the only evidence of any recent use was the empty ale barrels stacked for collection. There was a musty smell, mixed with the sickly stench of decay permeating from the direction of the body. Faversham had been thoughtful enough to provide nosegays for them, which offset this a trifle. 6 barrels had been pressed into service to act as a table to bear Tolliver's corpse. It was still covered over with the tarpaulin, presumably to keep off the rats that Doyle had heard scurrying for cover when they had entered the stable. Faversham started to unlace the covering and glanced up at the doctor. "Would you happen to be the gentleman that Scotland Yard promised to send out, sir?" The doctor frowned. "You couldn't possibly have contacted the Yard yet about this matter," he observed. "No, sir, not about this, about the children." "Ah." The doctor shook his head slightly. "I have, on occasion, worked with Scotland Yard constable, but I remain for the most part an independent observer. I am here only to offer my expertise if Sir Alexander or either of these medical gentlemen wish to avail themselves of it." "I see, sir." Faversham sounded disappointed. Doyle asked, "Children?" Sir Alexander sighed. "Some of the local urchins have gone missing, it appears. It didn't seem to me to be anything for concern, as Constable Faversham is quite capable. But one of the boys from Westwood Ho, the local school, went missing several days ago. His parents are apparently well connected, and they demanded a plea for aid from the Yard. So far, other than promises, nothing much has materialised." "Would that be a boy named Anders?" asked the doctor. "That's right, sir," Faversham said, pausing in his work of uncovering the corpse. "Joshua Anders. I thought you weren't involved with that." "I didn't think I was," the doctor said thoughtfully. "But Miss Smith and I met 3 of his friends last night. They mentioned his name. How many are missing in all?" "Hard to say, sir," Faversham informed him. "Seeing as how most of them have neither kin nor friends, it's hard to be exact." "Be inexact, then." "About 15, perhaps more," Faversham admitted. 15 children missing?" the doctor exclaimed. He rounded on Sir Alexander. "And you didn't think that significant?" "They aren't merely wharf rats and street urchins, Doctor," the Justice protested. "We don't know that anything has happened to them at all." "Of course not," the doctor agreed sarcastically. "Probably just popped off down to Brighton for a paddle in the sea. Hello?" The constable had finished unwrapping the body now and pulled off the tarpaulin. The doctor peered at it in fascination. Both Sir Alexander and Dr. Martinson paled and turned away. "What do you make of it, Doyle?" asked the doctor. Doyle stepped forward eagerly. "As you can see, Doctor," he explained, "Tolliver was killed by the bite to the face. The teeth have left striations on what remains of the frontal and sphenoidal bones. The arm was taken off in a subsequent attack after he was already dead. There is too little blood marking the side of his jacket, so the heart must have stopped pumping by that point in time." The doctor nodded approvingly. "Excellent deduction, Doctor." He whipped a small magnifying glass from a pocket and bent over the grisly remains of the head, apparently oblivious to the nauseating stench. "And what do you make of the angle of incisions?" Doyle frowned. "I'm not sure I follow you, Doctor." "Well, look at the way the bones have been shattered in the face and how the flesh is torn from the arm." He glanced back at the two older men. "I'm sorry, would either of you care to take a closer look? I didn't mean to hog the best position." "No, Doctor," Sir Alexander replied, blanching at the suggestion. "Please, carry on. I'm more than happy to listen." "As you wish." The doctor seemed puzzled at this reaction. Ignoring it, he turned back to Doyle. "Do you think a shark could have done this?" Grinning, Doyle shook his head. "No. Sharks always attack the limbs, and invariably the limbs of a person in the water. But the limb was severed after the bite to the face, and Tolliver was never in the water." He gestured at the corpse's waistcoat pocket. "As you see, his baccy pouch is dry." "Capital!" approved the doctor, slapping Doyle heartily on the back. "Absolutely sound reasoning. You noticed also, no doubt, that the angle of the bite is all wrong. I think we can safely assume that poor Tolliver here was staring down at whatever killed him. The attacker ripped off the front of his face. Sharks have their mouths on the underside of their heads, so to be able to rip off the face, a shark would have had to have been swimming on its back at the time. So we can discount that. Whatever creature did this has to have its mouth forward on its head. And offhand, I can think of no species of aquatic animal that is native to the earth that might be held accountable." Dr. Martinson took a nervous step forward. "Does it have to be a marine creature that killed him, Doctor?" he asked. "After all, Tolliver was found on his boat, which was drifting. Is it not possible that there was on board with him some terrestrial animal, such as a savage dog, that killed him?" "And then vanished?" asked the doctor sceptically. He shrugged. "It is a possibility," he agreed. "After all, Sir Edward and his friends were hunting some such creature on the moors last night." "Well, there you are then," Martinson exclaimed. "Surely that is the creature we're after." "I don't believe so." The doctor looked very thoughtful. "For one thing, it was quite a distance inland, and not much later than the time when Tolliver died. I myself saw the beast, and it showed no signs of having been for a swim." He gave a sudden smile. "Still, there's one way to be certain, isn't there?" He turned to Faversham. "I take it that Tolliver's boat is somewhere around and hasn't been touched?" "Aye, sir, it's moored up just behind the tavern." "And," added Doyle, "I paid Brackley to keep an eye on it and see that it wasn't disturbed." "Excellent," approved the doctor. "I'm beginning to think that I'm really not needed here at all. You seem to be proceeding perfectly well without my aid." Sir Alexander frowned. "But what will the boat tell us about Tolliver's death?" he asked. "Where it occurred," the doctor answered. "But we know where it occurred," the justice retorted. "At sea." "Yes, but from the sea or from the boat?" asked the doctor. "If the creature that killed him was on the vessel with him, then there will be buckets of blood all over the deck. If it was from the sea, then the majority of the blood would have gone into the water, and the decks will be relatively clean." "Wonderful!" exclaimed Doyle. "You are most certainly proving your worth, Doctor. Well, are we done here?" "Almost," the doctor answered. "Let's see if we can't make poor Tolliver bear a little further witness against his slayer first." "Surely," objected Dr. Martinson, "we've got all we can already from this noisome relic." The doctor gave him a wide smile. "Bear with me, Doctor. Let's make a few small assumptions. First of all, whatever killed Tolliver didn't do it for food. An animal that hunts ends the blow at a vulnerable area, a limb or the throat, depending on whether it kills by biting or strangulation. This creature instead attacked the face. A small target, if you think about it. But the only one offered if Tolliver was leaning across the bows of his boat, Sir Alexander put in. Correct. The doctor's eyes sparkled. Another blow against the idea that his killer was on the boat with him. Now, the body was on the boat when it was found, so Tolliver must have fallen backwards. The missing limb led Doyle to suggest that the killer attacked the corpse again as it fell. There wasn't a great deal of time for that, so the odds are that there were in fact two creatures that attacked him almost simultaneously, one killing him first with the bite to the head, the second severing the limb. "I say," exclaimed Sir Alexander, "so now instead of one mysterious killer creature, we now have two?" "More than that," the doctor commented. "Two hunting together. Intriguing, isn't it?" "Intriguing?" the Justice shivered. "It's downright scary." "That too," agreed the doctor. He turned to Faversham. "Well, that's about it for here. Perhaps we could examine the boat now." "Very good, sir. If you care to go on ahead, I'll cover the body again." The constable turned to Sir Alexander. "Can I inform the rector that the body is ready for burial now, sir?" "You can indeed," Sir Alexander answered. "The sooner the better, if you ask me." Sarah grimaced and stared at her three admirers. "Don't you have something better to do?" she asked them. "Like lessons, for instance?" "No," Kipling replied. "Term starts next week, so we're free." "And at a loose end," added Dunsterville. "So here we are." "And you're awfully pretty," Beresford finished, "so we don't mind being seen with you. It'll do our reps scads of good." "Wonderful," Sarah muttered. "And my nerves irreparable harm, probably." She was starting to wish she hadn't wanted to meet Kipling. As an adult, he would have been fascinating. But as a 15-year-old boy, well, he was a 15-year-old boy, and that said it all. Now what? Since the men had effectively shut her out from their autopsy, she might as well get to work on something else. "This friend of yours who vanished," she said, hoping that this would distract their attention from her body for a while. "Tell me about him." "Well, he wasn't really our friend," Dunsterville confessed. "He's only 10 after all. And he's not at all sophisticated like us," Kipling added. "Give me a break," muttered Sarah. "And he's more like a responsibility," Dunsterville said, staring at Beresford. Beresford nodded. "His pater and mine are chums, you see, and we were asked to sort of keep an eye on him," he pouted. "And you know how infernally dull that can be." Sarah was starting to catch on. "And what did you do with him?" she asked. "Nothing," Beresford protested. "Well, almost nothing," Kipling amended. Raising an eyebrow, Sarah surveyed them sceptically. "Let's have it." Both the other boys looked at Beresford, who shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "Well, the truth of the matter is that we ragged him a bit, and told him a few fibs about ourselves, and said he'd got a lot to learn." "Such as?" Sarah prompted. "Well, about women, for example," Beresford admitted. "We spun a few yarns." "You did," said Kipling smugly. "Mine were all true." "A few yarns," Beresford continued, "about the fish girls here in the village. So he skipped out one night last week and never came back." "I see," Sarah sighed. It was typical of teenaged boys, but Anders had been a young and impressionable target. "So how much of this did you actually tell the police?" "Faversham?" Dunsterville looked appalled. "Just that Anders left early in the evening, nothing more. He wouldn't understand what it is to be a man of the world like you do." "Thanks, I think," said Sarah dryly. "OK, let's start from there. Do you happen to recall if you mentioned any names to Anders, or were you too polite for that?" Kipling sniggered. "We did casually let Jen Walker's name crop up." Now she was getting somewhere. And did this lady ever see Anders? Dunsterville shrugged. We don't know. She isn't speaking to us just at this moment. I can't imagine why, Sarah said. So where can I find her? Kipling hooked a finger over his shoulder. She works here as the barmaid, he told her. Dark-haired and almost as pretty as you are. He glanced at Sarah's ankles. I'll bet you have nicer legs, though, he added hopefully. Dream about them, Sarah suggested. Right, you lot stay here. I'll go and have a chat with this Jen Walker. As she started to move off, she added, and try not to harass anyone while I'm gone, okay? Us? Asked Kipling, the picture of innocence. Would we do that? You'd better not, Sarah advised him, or there's likely to be 3 more missing kids by this evening. Tolliver's boat was a typical small fishing vessel. The nets were still on the deck, and the sail had been furled, obviously after it had been moored. Otherwise, Brackley assured them, the boat was exactly how it had been when the men had found it adrift. The doctor scurried aboard and began peering at the gunwales. Doyle, Martinson and Sir Alexander followed him. Brackley hovered at the top of the plank. Where was the body discovered? Doyle asked. 4 of the cabin, sir, Brackley replied. Doyle nodded and skirted about the tiny structure. On the deck was a splash of dried blood. Ah, he exclaimed, not sufficient for Tolliver to have been attacked on board. He glanced at the cabin. And nowhere for any terrestrial animal to hide either. So he was definitely attacked from the sea. I agree, the doctor commented, kneeling beside the gunwale close to Doyle. What do you make of this? Doyle bent to examine the marks the doctor had found. The doctor offered the use of his magnifying glass, which Doyle accepted. Scratches in the wood, he observed, puzzled. I'm afraid that the significance of it escapes me. Recent, the doctor commented. The wood exposed is unweathered, and it's close to where the body fell. I'd say that whatever killed Tolliver made these marks. There are just the 2 of them, here and here. He pointed to the 2 gashes, about 2.5 feet apart. That suggests a width for the creature. The marks are probably the result of its flippers or fins striking the wood. There's no sign of blood in the marks, objected Doyle. Surely any blows sufficient to make these gashes would have scored the skin of the attacker and drawn blood. Unless the hide was too tough, the doctor said. In many aquatic creatures, the skin, especially on the nippers, is extremely tough. Sir Alexander frowned. Are you suggesting that he was killed by something like a seal? Your mention of nippers suggests that conclusion. The doctor gave a large smile. And some seals have very sharp teeth, he pointed out. They are carnivores, after all, and their mouths are positioned well for the attack. But they have never been known to attack a man, protested Martinson. No, agreed the doctor thoughtfully, but this has all the indications that they have started now. He pondered ideas for a moment. They are trainable, he mused. I wonder. Sir Alexander was almost spluttering. But there are only a few grey seals about this coast, he protested, and they are perfectly harmless. I agree, the doctor said. He looked up at Doyle suddenly. Is the Hope a whaler alone? Why, no, Doyle replied. We've also got a fair supply of seal skins. No live ones, though. Of course not, Doyle answered. There's no market for them. The doctor removed his cap and ran his hand through his mane of curly hair. Isn't your vessel out of some Scottish port? He asked. Peterhead. Ah, the doctor gave another of his smiles. And what brings it to Devon, then? Doyle shrugged. Captain Grey had business here, that's all I know. Look here, broke in Sir Alexander. Surely that is irrelevant to the matter of Tolliver's death. Irrelevant? The doctor stared at the justice as if he were a silly child. A whaling ship stops off here instead of Scotland, barely hours before a man is killed, and it's irrelevant. It has a cargo of seal skins, and the man is apparently killed by a pair of attack seals, and it's irrelevant. He whirled around to face Doyle. I'd like to have a word with this captain of yours. Doyle shrugged. I can introduce you to him when he returns to the ship this evening, but he's not aboard right now. The doctor nodded. And who is it that he has business with? A man called Breckinridge, that's all I know, Doyle answered. Sir Alexander smiled. Well, then, that's no problem, is it? The doctor glared at him. It might not be, he snapped. It might help if I knew who this Breckinridge was. The justice stared at him in amazement. Surely you must have heard of him? If I had, the doctor retorted, I wouldn't need to ask questions, would I? Well, Sir Alexander said, taken aback. He's an industrialist who built a factory on the edge of the village last year. He's very well known and quite a pleasant chappie. You know him? Well, Sir Alexander admitted, I think he's done splendid work since he arrived here, and he's given many of the locals jobs when they would otherwise be starving. He's a very generous and kind man. I'm sure you would like him. I'd appreciate the chance to meet him, the doctor agreed. He looked around as Faversham hurried up the jetty toward the boat. Ah, there you are. What kept you? The policeman was almost out of breath. Another crime has just been reported, he announced, huffing and panting. And I thought this was such a quiet little town, the doctor observed dryly. Well, what's the latest event in this crime spree? Somebody broke into the cemetery last night, Faversham said. They dug up the grave of Mrs. Bolivar and stole her corpse.